Hello, everyone. Hello, Ollie.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Marcos.
Lulu. Right. So this evening, or day, or whenever you're watching this, because this is YouTube land, I always forget. We're just going to talk, I think, a little bit about plants and planets.
Plants and planets. Why not?
Yeah, this was just because a question we got under our first video. Oh, and by the way, we've broken 10 subscribers now.
Whoa, double
Yay!
digits. Whoa.
We're in double digits. So this is our third episode. So hopefully we can get some more. So
Maybe it'll be a
the next
geometric
landmark will
progression.
be 100. So that might
100,
take a while. We'll
yes.
see. We'll see. Anyway, thank
So,
you to anyone who has subscribed and
planets and
welcome.
planets. Planets and planets. I think the first thing that pops into my head, and I suspect this will be for a lot of people, when they first come across astrological medicine, it's because they've read Culpeper. And in his big book, he ascribes a planet to every plant. And I
Mm,
remember reading this back in the day and thinking, well, that's really interesting and sort of cool, but why? Because he never actually really explains it. Well, he does explain it, but in quite cryptic ways within the book. And you have to do quite close reading a lot of stuff. Wouldn't you agree, Marcus? You're looking skeptical.
No, no, no. That's my ruminating face,
Oh, you're
Ollie.
with
It's
me.
it's not.
So yes, so one of the things when I learned astrology before herbalism, funnily enough, so I always had an interest in herbalism. And it was just very exciting and pure chance that when I learned herbalism, that Marcos was one of the clinicians teaching, and it was like, oh, and he's a medical herbalist, astrological herbalist as well. Isn't that handy? And so then I was initiated into the mysteries of what all those planets in Culpeper are actually for and why they're there, and the great history behind it as well, obviously.
Mm,
Um, because again, it's something I've noted that lots of people, you'll read a lot of herbals, particularly the more esoteric ones, where this is still repeated, this planet is X. But again, there's no real explanation of why. Well,
mm.
why it's useful, I suppose, would be more, I mean, the thing is, of why that would be useful to anybody. Um, Marcos, why would it be useful for anybody?
Well, okay, there's a few tangents there. Thanks, Ollie. So I guess the reason why plants were assigned to particular planets was mainly practical in a weird sense. Um, in the sense that when you were using astrology, in the sense of using a decumbiture or perhaps even a birth chart to work out uh, what somebody's disease was all about, the person would be represented in the chart by a planet. That planet would symbolize that person in that particular situation. That would be their planetary avatar. And one of the ways that you could strengthen that person would be using herbs or treatments of that planet. For example, another way that the planet might feature in your treatment in some way, a particular planetary symbol, would be if the 10th house, which is a part of the chart, which may represent the treatment, if the, and this is going to get into some astrological jargon, if the ruler of the 10th house is strong, meaning the 10th house being the part of the chart, it's actually the middle of the sky, sometimes called the MC or the medium coli, which is sort of like where the sun gets to in the middle of the day, like 12 p.m., where the sun is. That part of the sky represents the treatment, and the sign which is there, the zodiacal sign, has a particular planetary ruler. And if that planet is strong, which gets into all this other astrological technical stuff, but basically, if that planet's in good shape in the chart, then that will represent some probably helpful medicines for that patient. And there's some other technical bits and bobs you could look at the rule of the 10th to see if it would help the patient. So there's two different ways in astrological charts about a medical situation where the planets, and there's other ways, but those are a couple of the main ones. One would be the patient themselves would be represented by a particular planet, and you'd want to enhance the power of that planet in a way in order to enhance the vitality of the patient. And in another way, the chart might show that a particular kind of medicine would be helpful. So, to give an example, like if, say, the ruler of the 10th house of medicine was a strong Mars, then you think, what does Mars, the planet, rule traditionally? And it might rule surgery or uh, cutting or burning or poisons or needles or that kind of thing. So it may be indicating more generally that surgery might be helpful, or acupuncture, or some kind of physical therapy or something like that. But in terms of plants, you might look to plants which are ruled by Mars. And likewise, if you have the patient in the chart represented by, say, Saturn, you've got a Saturn ruled sign on the ascendant, which is the part of the chart that represents the patient, like Capricorn or Aquarius rising, then you'd use herbs of Saturn, because that's the planet that traditionally ruled Capricorn and Aquarius. So you'd use Saturnian herbs. There's much more to it than that, but basically in the sense that, like, you'd also look at the humoral factors, so you'd need to know your herbal medicine. Basically, you can't just chuck any old planet ruled by Mars at them, or any old planet ruled by whatever. But in terms of the astrology, it would help you narrow down the selection.
To rewind a little bit there, and I think that Kubersoul said you didn't need a simpler way if you didn't even know astrology, because obviously we've talked about herbs associated with a planet, but also each planet is associated with various parts of the body,
particular organ, yes,
and organs. Yeah. And so if you had a terrible, say there was menorrhagia, terrible, overproduction of menses, some very difficult periods, which is the womb.
Yeah, heavy periods for non-medical people.
I can't imagine the simple ones. Only the complicated ones are coming to my head now. That and the womb is something that is ruled by the planet with the moon. And you've got to realize that in astrology, the sun and the moon are planets, and always have been, funnily enough. So when people say, the sun and the moon aren't planets, that's actually a modern affectation, because they were planets before they were anything else. It's just the moderns have taken the word planet to just mean the planets the objects that go around the sun.
Yeah.
Not the sun and not the moon, but actually the Greeks got there first with planets, which means wanderers, which mean basically things that move around in the sky.
From a geocentric perspective. Yes, from the perspective of us on Earth. Yeah.
Back to heavy periods. And so you would think, okay, I want maybe a herb of the moon, because the moon is in charge of the womb. And you will find that actually many of the herbs that Culpeper has listed as moon herbs, and Venus herbs, which was also part of that, will be very effective in that. And so in this aspect, you wouldn't just say, oh, we'll take willow then, that's a moon herb. You would actually look through and think, okay, I can now drill down, rather than all these thousands of herbs, I can now drill down and think, oh, let's first look at some moon herbs, some Venus herbs, see if there's anything good there.
It's just exact. That's perfect, Ollie. It's helping narrow down that selection. So that's and thank you for because that's as you said, that's a simpler way. You don't need to do a chart or need to do any technical astrology for this. You just look at what bit of the body is going wrong, what planet traditionally was said to rule or represent that organ, and then you can select a herb of that. So but then you need to know what bits of the body the planets rule, and so on and so forth. So
yes, and that's that you can look up fairly easily, but that is a lot simpler than learning astrology, which I thoroughly recommend, obviously, but as you're getting started.
Yes, exactly. That's it's so just to give a simple example of that, like you mentioned, the sort of wonky wombs, the heavy periods, which is a very common issue for lots of women, and take another fairly common one. You might have stomach upset. Well, that might be a moon problem traditionally, so because you'd look at the moon, or you could have a sore throat. That might be a Venus issue, because Venus rules the throat traditionally. And you might have, I don't know, pain in the shoulder. That's a bit more tricky, but that could be a Mercury problem, maybe, because the shoulders, arms, and hands ruled by Mercury, and so on and so forth. So sometimes these are a little not quite so easy to pin down. But if you've got a particular organ, like the liver, that's Jupiter, the kidneys of Venus, pancreas, difficult to know because traditionally the pancreas didn't exist, but we'd probably put it under Venus in a modern sense, because pancreas governs things like blood sugar and digestion of sugars and proteins and fats. But yeah, so although that is arguable. So anyway, the
Yeah, maybe because some people don't like Jupiter as well, as it's just part of the liver sort of function, maybe.
yes, exactly. We could get into the weeds on that one. I tend to lean towards Venus just because I've seen a few charts of people with pancreatitis having a heavily afflicted
Interesting.
Venus, but and also it does govern that blood sugar thing, um, but yeah, you could absolutely lean towards Jupiter because Jupiter traditionally rules the faculty of digestion. So if you want, so just before we go into the sort of plants and planets and how they're classified, which was your initial point, I think, Ollie, was if you're looking for sort of lists of the probably the best short version of how of what planets rule what kinds of things in traditional sources is probably to be found in William Lilly's Christian Astrology book one, I think.
One, yes, I think it is.
Yes, yeah, where he lists um sort of like say Saturn rules is has this nature and rules things of this nature and gives lists. So Saturn rules like old things, decayed things, small, dark, dense, usually dark in color, older, sour tastes, and he describes all the different characteristics that you might expect Saturn things to have, and then gives examples of different Saturn things in many different categories, including types of people, minerals, objects, animals, and plants.
Bonds.
So yeah, so
Now,
so that
there's something we need to touch on here because I know
yes,
this freaks a lot of people out, and this is one of the reasons why astrology is an art rather than a science, possibly an
yeah,
art and eon in the end. I don't know if you'd like that, but um, they don't always agree. So,
yes.
and it freaks a lot of people out. When you start getting into this, I'm going to have to find an example. Um,
I can think.
Something like,
Okay.
can you give me well, just to say that, so Lily might say a plant is ruled by Mars or Jupiter, and Culpeper might say this is actually ruled by something else. Now, Marcus will now give me. I only think
Yeah,
of
I can think of a couple of
go on.
examples if it helps, Ollie. I mean,
That does help.
one would be so there are some where they all agree on, like nettles Mars,
Yeah. No,
uh,
no doubt. Yeah.
garlic Mars, and we'll because they basically Mars was hot and dry and burning and sometimes stinging or sometimes thorny or toxic. So any plants that are obviously really thorny or stinging or toxic or caustic will be Mars. So nettles, garlic, onions. But there was some which as Ollie you were saying don't there's discrepancies. So one of them might be mullein, for example. So Culpeper says mullein is ruled by Saturn, and I think Lilly says if he mentions mullein at all, it's ruled by Jupiter. And I think Kyranides, one of the older Greek sources, says mullein is Jupiter. So and there you really have to, as Culpeper himself said, keep your brains in your head, not in your books, for that is the place ordained to them. So you have to, and also Culpeper was a great one for slagging off tradition. Ironically,
Yeah.
now that he has become the tradition or part of the tradition, he said very often, he called men are led by the nose by tradition as bears are led to the stake was another great Culpeper quote. He'd say like if you get too bound up with the rules, you can lose the point is another way of saying
Another example I know which comes to my mind actually is polypody root, which is like not a well-used herb nowadays, which is what
yes, I use it a lot.
favorite line. Yeah, you taught me about it.
Yeah,
So Culpeper has that as ruled by Saturn, but Sibley,
Saturn,
in his updated version of Culpeper, has it under Jupiter. But if
yes.
you think about this, Culpeper had it for sort of unbinding, sort of tight things. Saturnian because it was to do with sort of getting burnt collar out and stuff. I think I remember it was this sort of
Yes, yeah. Well, let's come back to polypody, Ollie, because I think let's start with mullein, and then I'll
Okay,
come back.
okay,
I'll let you. I'll unpack mullein a bit, and then you can unpack
okay,
polypody a bit,
fine, yeah,
because then we can because just
fine.
to because I want to backtrack a little bit and say what. So we've talked a bit. Lily, you can find a list of why the characteristics that were assigned to different planetary symbols, and from there you can logic why particular plants were put under those particular classifications.
Yeah.
So why are there discrepancies between different authors? Well, that's simple. It's because certain plants may have qualities that could belong to one or more planet, let's say. So it really comes down to the sort of how do you classify? And I think that you could classify on the basis of where, and they used all of these things. So the plant's habit, how does it grow? Its habitat, where does it grow? Its medicinal, its perceived medicinal qualities, like its temperature traditionally, was it heating or cooling or drying or moist? Its medicinal actions, like is it purgative, is it binding, is it anti-inflammatory, what does it do when you ingest it? And even the myths associated with the planet, and of course its appearance, its color, all of these things would be used to classify it. So some of them, like say you had a plant that really likes the shade, it's poisonous, it's all stunted and withered, it's like really dark in color, it's going to be a Saturn herb, there's no question. But many plants have mixtures too. So to bring it back to mullein, Culpeper said mullein was a plant of Saturn. And I think the argument, he doesn't really say why, but I think it's because it's slightly binding. He says it's useful for diarrhea, and he says it's for old coughs. And I think that the general vibe from reading his bit on mullein is that it seems it's good for old people and old diseases and old coughs, and it's binding. But actually, if you read between the lines, what he's really saying about its medicinal action is it helps digestion, it helps soothe the lungs. And then when you actually look at the plant, mullein is a huge plant that grows straight up from the ground with big, soft, fluffy leaves. And it does have a strong central spike, but it has bright yellow flowers, a strong central spike of bright yellow flowers. And it seems to enjoy growing in full sun, none of which to me screams Saturn. And one of the traditional names, it was Hig taper, because they used to use the central thing as a taper for burning, for making light. And all of that just seems, so it wasn't really used for, as far as I know, there were no necromantic uses for it. It's not, there's no hidden toxicity or anything like that. It's not, and it's appropriation to the lungs. Traditionally, Jupiter was the ruler of the lungs. Some astrologers would say Mercury. I'd say that's a more modern assignation. Traditionally, it would be more Jupiter rules the liver and the lungs, I believe. Although Mercury might have some sub-rulership of the lungs. That's going to get us into abstruse, how many angels dance on the head of the pin astrological arguments, which we don't need to get into right now. But anyway, so the mullein issue. I would actually come down more on the side of mullein being a Jupiter herb rather than a Saturn herb. And so this is interesting, because this we can let's talk about polypody, and then let's come down to some of the metaphysics of these classifications, because like, why do they work, how could they work, etc., because I think that's interesting.
Okay, I mean, polypody is an interesting one. It is I mean, Culpeper recommends for a number of things. It's one of the few cures he has for nasal polyps, and basically it's again an unbinding herb for getting rid of sort of old stuff, sort of thing, and it's also unbinding. It's a laxative as well. I think he says that.
Yep.
And I think Sibley looked at it and only used it as a laxative and didn't use it for anything else, and so thought, well, this doesn't seem to do anything very Saturnian, but it's a little shrub, grows very close to the ground. It likes moist, dark places. It doesn't have any flowers. It's not flamboyant.
It's a fern. It really likes damp places.
It does.
As you say, shade, and I've seen it growing literally seen it growing on the trunk of a tree in Wales, and the tree was covered in moss, and it was in the shady sort of.
And it'll grow on walls as well. I've seen it growing, so it doesn't need a lot of earth. So it's very tenacious. So I think it's we can say that its signature is very Saturnian. So
yeah, that's a brilliant example, Ollie, because you've got there a difference potentially between the habit and habitat of the plant, which seems to lean towards Saturn, and the perhaps the medicinal effects.
It's interesting. It's this thing that, like, I mean, in some ways, Jupiter and Saturn are opposites to each other. Saturn tends to bind and constrict, Jupiter tends to unbind and expand.
Yeah.
But equally, if you've got something that you want unbinding, maybe you want to go to Saturn because it knows all
Yeah,
about that
yeah.
sort
I,
of
I
stuff.
think I think that this brings up an interesting secondary technical point, which is that this is another source of the discrepancies you'll find between authors. So, for example, I think it was it Gadbury? I can't remember who's um, the name of the author. Blagrave. Blagrave.
Oh, yes, a lovely
Yes.
Blagrave, yes.
Yeah. So, is it Joseph Blagrave? Is
But I've got him up here somewhere. Where is he?
Yeah, so Blagrave is a contemporary, roughly, of Culpeper, and he's a yeah. I've got his book here, but
Yeah, that's the one.
I
Okay.
can't remember his first name. I do enjoy his book, but I don't regard it as highly as Culpeper's books on
No.
astrology, mainly because in the whole of the book there is but one chart example, and I'm just like, for somebody who's writing about practicing as a physician, as an astrological physician, like Culpeper's book is littered with examples of decumbitures and practical charts that he talks about. So that's a big minus for me for Blagrave, but I enjoy his book. But one thing Blagrave argues in contradiction to Culpeper is he classifies plants purely on, well, not purely, but largely on the basis of their perceived temperature, their medicinal action.
Yes.
So he says, for example, dandelion, which most authors say is a herb of Jupiter. I think that would Jupiter plants, as you're saying, some of the qualities of Jupiter might be expansive, large, generous. In terms of plants, they're very usually non-toxic. They're very
Yeah.
mild, food grade, beneficial. Jupiter's the great benefic. And so Blagrave is saying, well, actually, dandelion is very cooling traditionally, and Jupiter as a planet symbolizes slightly warming things. So he'd put it under Venus, particularly because it makes you pee, and that's what Venus is all about. Venus rules the kidneys. And I'm like, well, okay, fair enough. But by that rubric, using that method of classification, you couldn't put some plants into some categories in which they obviously belong. So, for example, hellebore or Christmas rose, which is a very toxic plant that actually affects the heart, but was used to treat melancholy and is quite toxic in small doses. I think to me is clearly Saturnian. It likes the shade. It has very dark foliage. It does flower, but only in midwinter.
Very
So
weird flowers as well.
it's to me it's a plant of Saturn in Leo, actually, Ollie. I think of that.
Oh,
I
interesting.
think
Yes.
so,
Yeah, I like that.
which
I like that.
brings up a whole secondary tier to our posology that
Yeah.
we'll have to talk about in a moment. But that of putting planets in signs ruling particular plants or things. But
But just
one
to pick
thing,
you up on the temperatures and I think another reason I wouldn't go down the Blagrave route is that Culper specifically says this system of assigning planets supersedes that Galenic temperature thing. I can't remember when you said it. So he does.
yes, he does, and
And
I think
so,
that's right.
he says we don't need to do this anymore. And lots of rules around it of like compounding things to the right temperature. It's quite fun to look at and do. But what he would say is just because something, traditionally Venus is cold and wet in astrological terms, but actually most Venus terms herbs tend to be warm and dry and quite mild.
Yes, yes,
He would say
exactly.
that's not the point. It's more important that Venus is a lesser benefic, and that is a very good temperature for humans.
Yes, and I think exactly that's well put, Ollie. And I think yeah, this also for me, it's clear to me, or at least my assumption is from reading Culpeper's work and Blagrave's work, that Culpeper was the busier consulting physician astrologer. At least that's how it appears.
Well, I would think to me, reading of Bloodgood, but he was very keen on picking the herbs in the right planetary hour, and there's a lot about that. And I think he was more into potentizing his herbs about when they were picked, than
Right.
about using astrology for when he was actually teaching his patients. So he's astrological as a herb picker and gardener, but not necessarily so much as a clinician.
Right. Yeah, I'd agree with that assessment, I think, Ollie. I mean, so for me, the line on classification is you don't just pay attention to one thing. So the temperature might come into it. If you have a violently hot or caustic burning herb, then that's going to probably make you think of Mars. And likewise, if you have a herb that is so cold it puts you into a coma or kills you, it's probably Saturn. Like at the
Yeah,
extremes, you're going to
yeah.
be tilted to those extremes. And
Yes.
likewise, if a herb is just very refreshing and temperately cooling, it might be Venus, possibly Moon. And if it's slightly warming and invigorating, it might be Sun or Jupiter,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
so that it does come in, but it's one of several things to
Factors.
look at that,
Yes.
that we mentioned earlier. So yeah, I think that's the key point there. So with polypody, I do tend to think it's a Saturn herb,
Me too.
but yeah, just because of exactly because the way it grows. And what's interesting is if you look at that, because it tastes like muddy licorice is the way I describe
Right. I
polypody.
love it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sweet, but it's
It's
kind of got
sweet.
this
Yeah.
muddy,
Nutty sweet. Yes.
yeah,
Weird.
earthy kind of.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting, and it's a wonderful plant for sort of as a mild laxative, sure, but it's also great for anti-inflammatory action, and I think particularly just an observation, not being clinically trialed, but for autoimmune conditions, it seems to be quite helpful very often. Um, and traditionally it was said to expel melancholy, yada yada. But one of
Yeah.
the interesting things about the biochemistry is I think it contains either like in common with many other ferns in the Polypodiaceae, I think it contains thiaminase. It blocks the action of a B vitamin, which is
Oh, right.
essential for sort of normal metabolism, and that makes me think that is a little bit of a Saturny action. So having this
Take it too much.
little potential sneaky toxicity there, just we'll just slide something in there. So but anyway, I would think that's probably one of the gentler herbs of Saturn, and there are gentle herbs of Saturn. A lot of them
Oh yeah.
are stronger, but there are gentle. Two other things I think one tangent sort of touched on. That maybe we'll try and end on that one because it involves some heavy thinking, uh, which may or may not be possible for either of us to do at this stage in the evening when we're recording this, but we'll have a go. But the first one would be you'll find Culpeper mentions sometimes this plant is an herb of this planet in this sign. Like he says, brambles, for example, is an herb of Venus in Aries. And he even says, sort of, if anyone asks why Venus is so, I can't remember the adjective he used, prickly or spiky, he says, tell them it is because she is in the house of Mars. So he uses the primary as the planet and then the sign as a secondary modifier. So in this case, he's saying brambles are a herb of Venus because they're pretty mild, they're slightly cooling. He says they're very useful for sores in the throat and in the genital region, which is both traditionally ruled by Venus. Binding, which is not a Venus feature at all. That's because the tannins, we now say. But and of course, brambles and raspberry leaves. Raspberry leaves more use in modern herbal medicine for the last trimester of pregnancy, and brambles have very similar phytochemistry, so they're probably pretty much interchangeable there. Although that wasn't a traditional use of bramble. But he says it's Venus in Aries, and the modifier is given in this case, I think, because of the habit of bramble, like the fact that it grows, it can grow up to an inch a day and it's spiky and aggressive in its growth.
Yes.
But he would definitely put it in Venus camp because of the sweet fruit that it produces, the fact that it's non-toxic, the fact that it's sappy and mild, but it just has this spiky drag that it wears. So that's
Marcos, is it not correct that Culpeper will sometimes use a zodiacal modifier to indicate a location as well?
Oh
So
yeah, give us an example.
particularly good for the lungs. He will say this planet in Gemini, sort of thing, or probably not Gemini. That's probably a bad example, but I think one was for the kidneys. He'll say, this planet in the
In Libra. Yes, you're
Libra.
thinking of yeah, he talks about eringos, which
That's
is
right. Yes.
the Elizabethan Viagra, I sometimes call it,
Yes.
that we use for coughs and for urinary dysfunction. That's sea holly, Eryngium maritimum, the roots. And yeah, you're right. He does discuss the roots as Venus in Libra, which I've always thought is a little interesting because it does have these very spiky leaves. And I'm like, So this is the point here is there aren't any hard and fast categories for a lot of plants. You have to use your brain to sort of like work out which one is the most likely. Now, for a lot of medicinal plants, there is substantial agreement. I'd
Yeah,
say
I
for
mean,
about
come on, don't worry.
50 to 70%, varying depending what sources you're reading, there's agreement or overlap at least. But then 30% of them that there isn't. So you kind of have to use your own brain. And this really gets the final point I wanted to, unless another we open up another rabbit hole in
I've
the
got
next.
one more point to go off that,
Oh,
but
okay. So maybe
depending
not the
on how we're
final.
doing for time, Marcus, you
Yeah,
can.
yeah. Maybe perhaps the penultimate. We'll see, because we don't want to leave any rabbit holes unexplored, really. But yeah, I think that what one of the points, then, shall I say, rephrase, um, would be why would this work? And I think I don't know is the ultimate answer to that one, except I do think of it in terms of as sort of more magical terms, really. Like you're framing things via a symbol, and it's like the symbol becomes a way of framing or classifying or viewing the reality. You're kind of identifying essential characteristics of the thing, and then identifying it with a particular symbol. And
Agreed.
depending on your ultimate metaphysic, like if you're more of a sort of chaos magician, like, or a 20th century occultist type, you might be thinking that would be how it works. If you put things into a particular category of thought or thought form, this is actually quite a Neoplatonic way of thinking, actually, where you're identifying things into a
This is a
particular thought
huge thing,
category.
and maybe we should have a whole section on this. But I
Mm,
mean, but I agree, and I mean, I think what you're getting at, Marcus, is that as one learns these associations, one should get agreement in one's own mind that I think Malin is blah rather than blah, because I think, to me, in a way, it doesn't matter how it works as long as it works. I mean, I don't know how my
yes, yeah, yeah,
it's trying
I'm
to
of the
drive
similar
off in
mind with
it.
that.
But I mean, if you're looking at metaphysics, I always like the one that and it's a terrible, not really meant to use quantum physics anymore because I don't understand it.
You'll be
But just
accused
as
of
I'm
quantum
just
woo,
using it
Ollie.
as a metaphor, that this whole thing that nothing is really fixed until you observe it. So we'll get a chart and we'll look at it and we'll interpret it, and it's that human interaction crystallizes the question.
Yes, and I like that idea. I do think that's a very 20th, 21st century
Pretty
metaphysic,
fair, I'd say.
and I like it. And that's broadly how I would frame it as well. Um, if we were going back a few hundred years, then obviously their frame, probably the Renaissance frame or maybe the medieval frame, would have been more essentialist. Like they'd have thought God would have put his stamp on everything, and that what we're trying to do is find out the essential nature of the thing and then
Yeah, but it's
classify it.
interesting. I think if you read the theology back in the day, and they said, like, again, we're going wildly off track here.
No, it's relevant.
My understanding of it is like, what's the point of praying to God for something when he's omnipotent? And I
Mm,
think my reading of this theology anyway is that because by saying a prayer, it crystallizes a need. Before that, it's an unspoken one. It's not going to happen or
mm.
might not happen. And I see it as a similar thing, man. So I think possibly Renaissance medieval people, other than thinking this is a vile heresy and magic and would burn you at stake,
Depending on who they were, yeah.
depending on who they were, might not, the metaphysics of it, they might say, well, yeah, actually, that's not unreasonable. But again,
Yeah, and
this is a
actually,
huge thing.
the Renaissance people, I think astrology and the astrological use of medicine was pretty mainstream for a
Yeah, it
lot of
was.
it.
Yeah.
So I don't think they'd have regarded it as a heresy. The heretical nature of astrology, it's always been semi-heretical depending how it's used. So weirdly, astrology, they were quite happy for astrology to be used for medicinal purposes, and I think that was because at least in the Christian West, and I think also in the Islamic parts of the
Right.
world,
Yes.
basically the monotheistic parts of the world, the reason astrology was given um, the green light in terms of medicine, but the red light in terms of predicting life
Things like
events
that.
for
Yes.
individuals, or at least the amber light, perhaps a sort of like a covered up light in a private boudoir. But the green light in terms of medicine was, I think, that sort of idea that it was reading the will of the divine, the will of God or Allah on earth, sort of
Agreed.
thing,
Yeah.
and therefore, and you were attempting to. This was all knowledge that was given
It
to
was immediate
humanity.
knowledge that you weren't trying to find out what was going to happen, like in a year's time, or whether the king was going to die or whatever, which was
Yes, exactly. You
appearing.
weren't you weren't trespassing on human divinely ordained free will. You were
Exactly.
using that information, yada yada. So, but yeah, I like that sort of Heisenbergy metaphysically, that the sort of like, but by observing something you crystallize it. I like that word. That's a really good word you use there. I think that's a valid thing. So your friend, and I really like the point you make about how the medieval person praying or whatever might have had a similar idea
Well,
with,
that's what I
with
want. I mean,
prayer.
I've been reading around this intro. It's an interesting thing. There's so much more theology around than people realize when they say, "Oh, they were simply, God, there are great tomes written on this
I,
stuff."
I'm increasingly of the opinion that everything is theology, just people don't realize it. But anyway, I think I think what was it? You was one more. There was
Okay,
one
there was
more
one little
rabbit hole.
thing, and we might have to address it another time because I remember this coming up. It's like, what if a herb, what if it's a modern herb, which we were very ancient, but like, what if it's an Ayurvedic herb or a Chinese herb that we don't have a planet for? And, I've got a big bottle of Panax ginseng here, but like, how do I know whether to use it or
I
not?
think Panax ginseng is a herb of the sun in Sagittarius. But anyway, so
But you
so
see, but this is the, I mean, it's like, for instance, I'll give you my example. I grow Eleutherococcus,
mhm,
Korean not Korean, Siberian
Siberian.
ginseng. And it likes to grow in dark places. It's a scrubby little plant. It's spiky. And so it's got a very Saturnian signature to me. And it has black berries, um, nasty black berries.
But it's
Um,
very non-toxic, and in
but it's
fact,
very
it's
non-toxic. But I do think, but it's all about giving endurance. And I mean, so you could argue for a Saturnian signature for it, but it's probably more of a sun one because it's not massively heating either. So I wouldn't give it to
tricky.
Mars.
This is
It's
tricky.
a
What
tricky
what what
one.
I do for some, so ginseng, I'm absolutely sure is solar.
Yeah.
It's a solar plant, because so there are certain, this is bringing it back to the, so when you're trying to classify an unknown plant, that's a great question point, Ollie, and it is very tricky sometimes.
Yes.
Some of them declare themselves, and some of them
Yes.
you have to really think about it. Sometimes for, I have found a number of years, and in many cases that I'm still not sure. Like Siberian ginseng.
Can I give you a good example, which again to me became apparent
Yeah,
as soon as I grew it. It was Chinese knotweed, Polygonum multiflorum Hoshowu.
yeah. Is that Saturn? I'd always assumed it was
No, it's
Saturnine.
it's very obviously a mercurial plant because you grow it.
Ah,
It's a great twisty vine, and of course it's very neuroprotective to all the nerves and stuff, and
yes.
very much in that way. And it just looks totally mercurial to me.
Interesting.
Very,
Okay. Interesting. That is interesting. I think in terms of classifying the plant itself, I would look at all of the things. Look at Lily. He's a good source for the
yeah,
essential characteristics of a planet, and just remember what they are. So, say Saturn herbs: cold, dry, binding, maybe slightly toxic, often like the shade. But think, and Jupiter herbs, the opposite, sort of big, uh, non-toxic, harmless, food grade, sort of generous plants, expansive. So dandelion, for example, is actually quite a small little plant, but is it expansive? Hell yeah, it grows
yeah,
everywhere.
gotcha. Yeah, yeah.
And so you can kind of, you can think of them in terms of all of that, and then just look at them in terms of their habit, as in how they grow, habitat, where do they grow, their appearance, their color, their shape, their size, etc., their medicinal properties, and any myths and legends around the plants too.
Point.
That those will, if you look at all of those things, you'll get a sense of what planet is associated with that plant. But here's a final spanner just to throw into the gears of the machine before we before we close up for the night. There's an additional potential wrinkle or complication here, which is that sometimes drugs or medicinal products were classified differently from the plant of origin. So,
Yeah.
for example, opium poppy or poppies in general, Papaver genus, because there are other genus, aren't there? There's like meconium or whatever, but Papaver were classified mostly under the moon. Like opium
Yes.
poppies were lunar,
Yeah.
but opium was classified as Saturnian
Of course, yes, because
very
it's
often
like very, very, yes, cold,
because
cold.
it's much
Yeah.
more narcotic, it's
Yes.
binding, it's highly sedative. From a Western humoral point of view, it's cooling. In Chinese medicine, it's heating, but that's a discussion for another day. The point is, it's a very extremely cold drug, and of course, it's a condensate. It's the resin from the opium poppy that's been cooked down and concentrated and whatnot. So the original plant was described as lunar, the product was described as saturnine. So you could potentially have a plant which is classified under one planet, but then it's so processed as to produce a remedy that is ruled by another. So that is a potential wrinkle just to bear in mind. And I do think there are some planets that some plants rather that are a bit ambivalent in their classification. But I suspect you'd agree with this, Ollie, that it's best to try and arrive at a conclusion just for yourself,
I
really,
agree. I agree.
to bring it down to one thing. And if you want to add nuance, you could think, well, maybe it's a plant of this planet in that sign. But
Exactly.
don't start messing around with the sign until you've sorted out what planet you think
Agreed.
it is.
Agreed. Yeah.
So for example, something like I would say dandelion would be Jupiter in Capricorn, interestingly,
Ooh.
because because I'd say Jupiter because it's this non-toxic food grade plant that's sort of yellow flowers. It's kind of joyful. It spreads everywhere, but it's and all the traditional authors put it under Jupiter except Blagrave, I think. But it's Capricorn because it's short. It has that long tap root that goes right down
Very
into
earthy.
the earth.
Yes. Yeah.
It grows very quickly and spreads very quickly. And Capricorn traditionally was a movable or cardinal sign.
Yes.
It's one of the
Yeah.
quicker moving signs. It's also Jupiter in Capricorn is in its fall. And dandelion is the poster child for herbalists. Love it. But it's the poster child also for weed killer adverts. Gardeners freaking hate it. You know that. But it's such a generous, uplifting, joyous plant. Like
Yeah.
you can't, so it's got that, and it literally benefits the joints. It was used for the gallbladder and the joints,
Yeah.
and Mars is exalted in Capricorn. Mars traditionally is the ruler of the gallbladder, and Saturn is the ruler of Capricorn. Saturn rules the joints and the skin. So I would, and also there's that meme. I don't know if you saw it a while ago with like a rose growing like a rose growing and it had it was put next door to a picture of a dandelion growing out of pavement, and the little thing under the rose was the pH is too high, I'm going to die. And underneath the dandelion was woohoo concrete. Do you know what I mean? It was just like so that just made that when I saw that meme, I was already thinking of dandelions as Jupiter and Capricorn, and that just confirmed it. It was like, yes, thank you for this little message from the universe confirming my classification. But I mean, it is somewhat subjective, I think, in summary. But I think there are grounds for arriving at consensus. But I think probably the most important consensus when you're practicing is to arrive at one in your own mind.
And I agree. And it's a great exercise to do just to get to know herbs better, is to say, I wonder why this is blah.
Yes, herbs and the astrology. It does
and
both.
astrology.
Like doing
so
this
it's
really
well
helps.
worth thinking. And I mean, we'll get on to receptions and things, but that's all very, very interesting as well. That'll be for another episode though.
Oh yes, that'd be different. Right. I think we've talked ourselves to the end of subject. I hope this is interesting to you. If it was, please like the podcast and subscribe and share it and whatnot.
Absolutely.
And we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you for a stimulating conversation.
Likewise. Thanks, Ollie.
Good night then.